Okay, we are live, and welcome to Nerd Church, the place where sometimes we provide the data about the dogma, and sometimes we talk about some of the weirder and more annoying things that go on in the Catholic Church. And today we get to do both because currently the Catholic Church is in what I like to call Schism Watch 2026. Because unlike Protestants, who frankly have been known to schism over arguments about whose job it is to make the coffee after church, um, when the Catholic Church schisms, it's serious and it's ugly and it goes on for centuries, and we really try to avoid it. So when the Catholic Church is in the process of going into a schism, this is something that's kind of worth taking a minute to think about. Okay, how did we get here and what the crap is going on? Especially since the SSPX, for reasons that will become very clear very quickly, is basically only something that is a major issue in the French speaking and English speaking world. So there's a whole lot of Catholics that don't know what's going on. And even in the English speaking world, there's a whole lot of Catholics who don't know what's going on. And then there's a whole lot of people who aren't Catholic, who don't have a dog in this fight, but, who like to hear about some really juicy drama and people being ridiculous. So here we are. Now, before we really get started, I just want to quickly show a map because I like maps. Because this will kind of put the... Okay, can you see my screen now?
Yes.
Okay, so this is the most recent map I could find. This is actually from the Society of St. Pius X's website. And this and all of the little dots are places where the SSPX has a group of priests that are getting together to do SSPX things. And as you can see, it's mostly located in Europe, mainly France, and in the United States. I actually have a few, I'm going to stop sharing now to just kind of share a few more quick statistics. So currently, the SSPX has 254 priests in France and 154 priests in the US. Now, this is out of a total of 733. So, for example, there are only 14 of these guys in Mexico. So I think that if you're a Mexican Catholic, you're probably more likely to be struck by lightning than you are to run into an SSPX priest, although you aren't quite as safe as you are in South Africa, India, Lithuania, Kenya, or the Dominican Republic, where each of those countries have 3 SSPX priests. So you might be asking yourself, why does the Pope even care about these guys? Because when you consider the size of the Catholic Church, these are like the SSPX is putting up rookie numbers, right? But there's still about 500,000 people that go to SSPX masses on a weekly basis. So that's not an inconsiderable number of people. And, the Bible has something to say about the shepherd who went looking for the one lamb that got lost, even though the rest of them were, cheerfully sitting in their barn doing what they were supposed to. So, in much the same spirit, they've got to try. Okay, so how did we get here to where they're threatening schism? Because to understand the current situation, you kind of have to go back to the past. Now, when we're talking about the Catholic Church, there's always the danger that, like, going back to the past is going to involve me saying something like, in 155 CE, Justin Martyr wrote a description of a Sunday meeting. But so keep in mind, we're fast forwarding through a whole bunch of Catholic history. When I start in 1903 with the papacy of Pius X, because we should at least mention the guy that they are officially supposed to think is completely awesome. Okay. You can see the picture?
No, I can, yes.
Okay, now you can see him. Okay. This guy is Pope Pius X. He becomes Pope in 1903 after the very long papacy of Leo XIII. And he's kind of like the first, like, kind of like people's pope in a long time. He makes a lot of changes that a lot of people thought were both necessary and important, including actually changes to the Mass. He puts in a new code of canon law. He does a bunch of stuff. On the other hand, he's also kind of has this kind of anti-intellectual bent. So he comes up with a couple of documents that condemn what he calls modernism, which in some ways was probably useful, because what he condemns as modernism is Marshmallow, hush. I'm sorry. Marshmallow also condemns modernism. But basically, the modernism that Pius actually explicitly condemns is like almost a straw man. So it's like, for example, like he cares about, so like the stuff that he's condemning is like, denying the resurrection, denying the virgin birth, like kind of things that nobody who considers themselves Catholic is actually going to do. So it kind of defines this very neat leftward, okay, you can't go past this point boundary. But it doesn't actually stop anybody from doing anything that people are actually doing in the real world in terms of, say, research into the historical Jesus. So then he dies, and he's really popular. And so he's kind of put reform back on the table, which is going to get important in 1951, because although can you think of something that happened in the mid 20th century, say between 1914 and 1951, that might have had an effect on Catholic doctrine regarding Jews?
Perhaps the,
Yeah,
among other things, the Holocaust?
yes, exactly. And okay, the in the action I want to be really careful about how I say this because the actions of some individual Catholics during the 1940s was absolutely exemplary. There were priests who died in concentration camps. There were future popes who legitimately could say that they had personally saved the lives of thousands of people. However, the Catholic Church also, as an institution, owned up to the fact that part of the history of anti Semitism that had made the Holocaust possible was the result of some not great things that the Catholic Church had done. And part of that effort of making sure that this doesn't ever happen again came in 1951 when Pope Pius XII um, revised the liturgy for Palm Sunday, Holy Thursday, Good Friday, and the Easter Vigil, specifically to remove the parts that said that the Jews were collectively and forever the people who had killed Christ. And that was a good thing. And that was a thing that very much needed to happen. And everybody was pretty much okay with that. So, okay. So this kind of kicks off a general period of, you know what, we should have some liturgical reform. Okay, now, guys, I realize this is all kind of boring, but walk with me because we're getting to the juicy stuff. Okay, it's about to get good, I promise. Okay, so 1956, Pius XII comes up with a project to completely revise the Mass because they decided it needed work. We could go into the whole history of liturgical reform, but like that's kind of a side point to what's going on here. What all you really need to know is the Mass used to be exclusively in Latin, except for the homily. A bunch of people didn't like that for a bunch of reasons. So now they decided to change it. Okay. So 1962, John the 23rd, let me, oh yeah, I have a picture of John the 23rd too that I'm going to put up real quick because we need can you see him now?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I like to have pictures of people where we actually have pictures because I would argue that it's really obvious if you look at John the 23rd why the current Catholic fasting memes, sorry, not memes, but the current Catholic fasting norms are so loose. Because although, does that look to you like a man who is used to missing meals?
Well, at least not regularly. Perhaps
Yeah,
he engages in a fast or two every couple of years.
yeah, exactly. Right. So this is a man who, if he's only eating one three-course meal a day, he's going to feel like he's suffering. And he's not going to ask anyone to suffer more than than he is willing to suffer himself. So that's John the 23rd. Okay. So we'll get to that next guy in a second. Okay. So he comes up with a new Latin missal in 1962. And then in um, and he also starts the Second Vatican Council, which is going to be like kind of the big council that's going to like reform the church, and all of the reforms that we think we need are just going to happen all at once. And a lot of people lose their damn mind over that. And one of and there's basically two big things that come out of Vatican II that people freak out about. One is the new mass, which drops in 1969, which basically says that the norm for the Latin Rite Church, so basically the vast majority of the world's Catholics, is going to be the mass in the vernacular, whether that's English, Spanish, Polish, Lithuanian, Tagalog, whatever. That's the language. And so, and it's so that means that if, say, I walk into a church in Mexico City, well, my ability to follow along, my ability to know what to say is going to depend on my facility in Spanish. Whereas if I walk into a Latin chapel, a chapel that uses, if I'm regularly attending a chapel that uses Latin in Arizona, and I walk into a Latin chapel in Mexico City, the only part that I'm not going to understand is going to be the homily. So it's a trade-off, right? It's universal access to the Mass anywhere you go versus meaningful access to the Mass at your home parish because it's in the language that you speak. Which is why, for example, today there's a lot of parishes like mine that are bilingual. Or you'll even have parishes that offer like masses in 2, 3, or even 4 languages at least once a month. You know, if they have like a large immigrant population. For example, in Arizona, there's a couple of churches in Phoenix that once a month will offer mass in Chinese because we are lucky enough to have a priest who can do that. And we've got a bunch of people that, we've got a bunch of Chinese speaking Catholics. Okay. So the other thing that happens is that because of the thing that happened in the mid 20th century where a bunch of people got killed, there becomes this willingness in the Catholic Church to consider that maybe this whole thing about how there's no salvation outside of the church, and maybe anybody who's not Catholic is going to hell, is kind of like not true. And definitely just not a cool thing to say. It just doesn't sit right with a bunch of people. So in 1965, while Vatican II is going on, they come out with this document called Dignitatis Humanae, which is a statement on religious freedom, which basically concedes that, people have a right not to be Catholic, and that people who exercise that right not to be Catholic are maybe not going to hell. Which is where And I'm going to share again briefly. Okay. Okay. So you see this guy?
Yes.
Okay. This is Marcel Lefebvre. Marcel Lefebvre was on the committee that ended up proposing the document that becomes Dignitatis Humanae. He was against it because Marcel Lefebvre was very much of the opinion that when it says there is no salvation outside of the Catholic Church, it means there is no salvation outside of the Catholic Church. Eastern Orthodox people, sorry. Armenian Orthodox, Armenian Apostolic Church of the East, sorry. Baptists, sorry. Anglicans, you get the idea, right? And basically, so he really doesn't like the religious pluralism part. He also really doesn't like the fact that the Mass isn't going to be strictly in Latin anymore. So basically, Marcel Lefebvre in 1970 is not a happy man. He's just not. Now, to be fair, there were a lot of people who were kind of not, and also there were a lot of people who were not real happy about going from the Latin Mass to the vernacular Mass for, just the fact that like this had been the Mass for about 400 years. People liked it, people were used to it. And for example, in like 1971, you have what's called the Agatha Christie Indult, which is called that because a whole bunch of like famous writers and artists with Agatha Christie's name being the mystery novelist, with her name being at the top of the list, saying, you know what, guys? We should at least allow priests to like celebrate the Latin Mass like in private for people who think it's cool. And the Pope says, yeah, okay, you can do that, but you have to get permission from your local bishop to make sure that like it really is just some like old guy who wants to do Mass the way that he's used to doing Mass. And everybody says, okay, and that's fine. So Lefebvre in 1970 gets permission to form the SSPX. So the deal at that time is they're going to be formed as a organization of priests on a trial basis for 6 years. They get to have a seminary in Switzerland, and that is what they get, right? So for 6 years, Lefebvre gets to ordain priests, he gets to supervise their education, and SSPX priests get to use the Latin Mass, right? So for a few years, everything is kind of sort of okay. Except that Lefebvre had previously, because Lefebvre had previously been making it sound like his main beef was getting rid of the Latin Mass. And as the 70s wear on, it becomes increasingly obvious that Lefebvre's problem was not with the Latin Mass. Lefebvre's problem was with the fact that the Catholic Church had pretty much decided that people who weren't Catholic were not going to be sentenced to eternal conscious torment when they died. And that, whatever else was going to happen, that popes are probably not going to, preach a crusade against the Methodists anytime soon. And Lefebvre didn't like that because he thought that they should have burned more Huguenots in France in the 16th century. So this gets us to remember how I said that this was going to be a 6-year trial. Well, in 1975, the Bishop of Freiburg was like, yeah, we gave it a shot. And you know what? Y'all are being kind of weird. And we don't like it. And you need to stop. And Lefebvre says, that's just your opinion, man. I'm going to keep doing my thing. This is what we call the paradox of tolerance, which basically says that people who are committed to behaving in a tolerant fashion towards dissent can end up in the position of allowing people who are being really, really terrible to be really, really terrible, because if you're committed to tolerance, it can be kind of difficult to tell people to shut up. So they tell Lefebvre to shut up only because the Catholic Church had just said, well, we aren't going to preach crusades, and we aren't going to lock people up in dungeons, and we aren't going to do all of the really terrible things that we used to do. When you get somebody like Lefebvre, they really don't have any good options other than telling him, stop this, you're being a jerk, nobody should listen to you. And that's basically what happens. So in 1976, Lefebvre, in spite of being told that he's not allowed to ordain priests, ordains a bunch of priests. And at that point, the SSPX is officially in schism. And Lefebvre is not allowed to ordain anyone. He's not allowed to give mass, and that applies to anybody he did ordain. And that continues to be the case until 1988. And this is where we get into the really entertaining backstabby part. Okay, so now in 1978, otherwise known as the Year of the Three Popes, because that was the year where Pope Paul VI died. John Paul I got elected and died a month later. And John Paul II got elected Pope. And he brought the Lefebvre in and says, okay, can we do a deal? And Lefebvre says, no, because we're not going to accept Vatican II. So then everything just kind of keeps going for a while. And then in 1984, John Paul II says, you know what? I'm going to let bishops give permission on a case by case basis for people who want to hear the Latin Mass, because it's becoming obvious at this point that there are some people who really just like chanting in Latin. They like smelling incense. They like, you know, only having to really listen to what the priest is saying during the homily and just kind of, zone out and enjoy the Latin. And John Paul II was not unsympathetic to that idea. So he, kind of loosens up restrictions on the Latin Mass. And in 1987, he gets Lefebvre to come in and have a sit down. And Lefebvre announces that the Pope is an apostate and that he doesn't have to listen to the Pope. And this is where we get to the first articulation of the absolutely crazy logic that the SSPX uses to justify everything that they're going to be doing from 1987 until now. Because remember, they're absolutely committed to the idea that there is no salvation outside of the Catholic Church, which is an interesting position for people who have been who had been in schism for 10 years to take, right? Because if there's no salvation outside of the Catholic Church and you are in schism with the Pope, that means that by Marcel Lefebvre's own logic, there was a big old lake of fire that had his name written on it. And Lefebvre at this point is old, is pushing 80 and sick. So he comes up with the theory that that's called sedi-privationism, which basically says that the Pope is in schism with the Catholic Church. So only the SSPX, which is doing things old school, is the real Catholic Church. So the Pope is just kind of there, sitting there, occupying the throne and like causing like sacraments to still exist. But nobody has to actually listen to what he has to say if they think that what he has to say is heresy. So it's like, so it's almost like Schrodinger's Pope, right? The Pope is in a box. And until the Pope emerges from the box that is Vatican II, the Pope is simultaneously both the Pope and not the Pope. Yes. I hope that made some kind of sense, at least as a logical proposition, because most people listen to that and they go, those guys are wacky. Which is basically the way that the Vatican is trying to get around the paradox of tolerance, is basically by causing these people to loudly and publicly say how ridiculous they are, they end up getting completely discredited. Okay? So we are now up to November of 1986. No, sorry, 1987. And so Lefebvre has just declared John Paul II to become an apostate, to have become an apostate. Okay. I'm going to share another picture so we remember where we are. Okay. This is John Paul II in 1988, right? He is kind of at the height of, he is the world's grandpa powers. So he has all of the advantage in his court. And he also has this guy, the future Pope Benedict XVI, who at that point is the head of the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith. Yes, Pope Benedict XVI started out as the Grand Inquisitor because in my heart, that's who the head of the DDF still is. Okay, so even after John Paul II had been called an apostate by Marcel Lefebvre, he was still willing to sit down with them, or rather have someone sit down with them. So he calls up the future Benedict XVI and says, okay, you deal with these guys. So Benedict sat down in May of 1988 and gets a deal. He says to Lefebvre, okay, you guys can have Anne Bishop, and we will let the SSPX join the Catholic Church as what's called a personal prelature, which basically means that most parish priests, right? There's like a chain of command that starts with parish priests and works its way up to the Pope, right? By making them a personal prelature, the SSPX would answer directly to the Pope with no like intervening supervision by the local bishops. And they would have gotten, under the terms of this agreement, one bishop of their very own so that they could continue making priests. In exchange for that, they were being asked to acknowledge that Vatican II was sufficient and legitimate, right? So the future Benedict XVI and Marcel Lefebvre sat down and they signed that document. John Paul II was supposed to sign that document in the morning. However, before that document could get sent, Lefebvre calls up his people. Lefebvre thinks about it and he says no. He just rips up the whole thing. And he's like, I want a new deal. And the future Benedict XVI says, that was the deal. You're not getting a new deal. There is not a better deal. That was it. And John Paul II was also legitimately very, very upset because he had offered these people a good, like a fair compromise, and they spit in his face. And then Marcel Lefebvre, okay, although I want you to make a prediction. Do you think he backed down? Do you think he
sorry?
Do you think
Sure.
do you think that Marcel Lefebvre backs down at this point?
Okay, so
I think although you froze for just a second. Although you're
Uh,
frozen. Okay, are you back now?
I'm back, yes.
Okay, now I can see and hear you. Okay, so do you think that Marcel Lefebvre backed down and acted like a normal human, or do you think that he escalates things?
I think he escalates things.
You're right. He does escalate things. And on July 1st, 1988, he ordains 4 bishops. Now, this is where we get into some like really nerdy Catholic definitions, and it's going to be kind of boring for 2 seconds, so bear with me. Okay. In Catholic understanding, a sacrament has to be like completely legitimate, completely on the up and up, has to be valid, and it has to be licit. Licit means that it's performed according to the rules of the Catholic Church, like with all the I's dotted and all the T's crossed, and it's perfect, right? That's licit. Then there's valid. Valid means that it wasn't done completely correctly. You didn't dot all the I's, you didn't cross all the T's. It's not flawless, but it happened. So, for example, if like someone has been baptized a Methodist, I'm picking on the Methodists because I don't know why. Okay, if somebody's baptized as a Methodist and they then decide that they want to be Catholic, they didn't have a licit Catholic baptism, but they had a valid Christian baptism. Therefore, they don't need to be rebaptized. In the same way, Marcel Lefebvre, by ordaining these bishops, was able to create a situation where the bishops were validly ordained, but they weren't licit. And performing an illicit ordination meant that he, the guy who had helped him, the retired bishop who had helped him ordain these bishops, and the bishops themselves were all excommunicated for schism. But they were still bishops. This is going to become important in just a little bit. Okay. So 1988, Lefebvre has burned all of his bridges. They are gone. And John Paul II, says, okay, yeah, all you guys are excommunicated for schism, and he also announces the formation of the priestly fraternity of St. Peter. The priestly fraternity of St. Peter were given permission to celebrate the Latin Mass whenever they want for funsies. They are allowed to use the 1962 Missal. They are allowed to use and they are also allowed to use the 1952 Missal. So basically, as long as they follow the church's line on, not being anti-Semitic jerks, they can do whatever they want. And at that point, a whole bunch of priests actually left the SSPX and joined the SSP because they weren't really down with the anti-Semitism and with being schismatics. They just wanted to offer the Latin Mass. And John Paul gave them a way to do it. And they were like, cool, we're good, we're going to do our thing. And he also, released the statement Ecclesia Dei, which basically said, okay, you know how like 4 years ago I said that bishops should feel free to give people permission to celebrate the Latin Mass whenever? Well, I really meant it. And, they should err on the side of giving permission. And that was where things stood. So at that point, the SSPX is out, right? Now, remember what I just said about the illicit but the illicit but valid consecrations. What that means is that for somebody who was for like a lay person who's just like going to the SSPX chapels for their religious services, they could tell themselves, okay, the priest was ordained by someone who had valid apostolic succession. But once Lefebvre died, and once the other priests and once the bishops that Lefebvre had validly but illicitly ordained start to fall off, they can't make that argument anymore. So that means that from the point of view of the Vatican, they could just let the SSPX go its own way. They can just let them die as an organization because by their own logic, they only have claim to any kind of ability to offer valid sacraments based on their having gotten valid ordinations that trace back to a Roman Catholic Pope. So that kind of, leaves them in this really weird position of having to continue to make nice with the Pope while completely disagreeing with them about absolutely everything. So they're just kind of twisting in the wind. And then in 1991, Lefebvre dies. And John Paul II is still, at this point, not inclined to be particularly merciful about things. And then Benedict XVI becomes Pope. And I am going to have to beg everyone's indulgence for about 2 minutes because I have to take a bio break. So, Aldo, say something entertaining to the people.
Okay. So, well, at least trying to be a bit neutral, impartial about this, I guess that it is at some point the higher ups in the Catholic Church gave them much space to negotiate, but it seems that the SSPX tried to do their own thing, and that is something which speaks about them as people. I guess they have their reasons to do the things the way they want, but on a personal level, on a social interaction level, I guess it is difficult for us to come to terms with people whenever you try to negotiate with them, because it only shows that they are not willing to actually negotiate, and that is a problem. Um, so they try to, in a sense, perhaps this is a strong word for me to say, but they try to hijack the authority of the Catholic Church for no good reason, and they decide to do that instead of just trying to reach um, for an agreement. That is the way I see it. I mean,
Yeah.
perhaps you differ from me.
Yep. No, I think that's a really excellent summary. Although I do think that we should mention that the well, they didn't have a good reason. They did have a very definite reason for hijacking the process.
Mhm.
And it's becoming increasingly obvious that that reason is anti-Semitism.
Right.
For the point that we will get that I'm going to get to right now. Because in 2000, so it's now 2000, so now in our story, we're up to 2007. This is only 20 years ago. By Catholic standards, that's like current events, not even
Mhm.
current events. This is what you read about in the newspaper. Okay. So Benedict the 16th um, makes peace with the SSPX to a very limited degree. What he offers them is essentially the same deal that he had offered them in 1988. They turn it down again. However, he reasons that the purpose of excommunicating someone is to make them go, you know what? I was wrong. I need to think about my life. I need to think about my choices. I need to reform my way of thinking. I need to reform my life, and I need to come back to the church. And Benedict is like, you know what? That's not what happened. What happened is that these guys came up with this weird seti privationist pretzel logic that lets them, simultaneously accept the authority of the Pope to the extent that SSPX services have always included. Okay, in the Catholic Mass, there's a point where the congregation offers various prayers for the community, and one of the elements of that is praying for the Pope, praying for the local bishops. So the SSPX has always included the name of the Pope in their prayer services. So, according to them, that means that they're in communion. According to the Pope, that's basically equivalent to buying your mom candy and flowers on Mother's Day and slapping her face the other 364 days of the year. And I'm personally, I'm Team Pope on that one. I know as a Catholic, it probably shocks people to hear me saying I support the Pope, but those kinds of bold, rebellious, spicy takes are why people come to nerd church, I feel. So yeah, so 2007, Benedict says, okay, the SSPX still does not have canonical status recognized by the Catholic Church. However, their members as individuals are no longer excommunicated. And we and he does throw them another bone. He says that SSPX baptisms are valid. Not licit, but valid, which in one way is a really huge sounds like it's a really huge concession. Oh, you can go and take your kid to be baptized at an SSPX chapel, until you realize that basically he's saying that we are acknowledging that the members of the SSPX are actually Christian in the sense that we believe that they adhere to the to the Council of Nicaea, because now I'm not going to call out any non-Trinitarian Christian denominations by name because you guys know who you are. And I recognize that in America in 2026, saying that somebody isn't really a Christian is fighting words. And that's not my intent because this is a technical definition. But according to the Catholic Church, Christians who cannot, in people who, okay, a Christian is someone who can, in good conscience, recite the Nicene Creed. And only Christian churches that adhere to the Nicene Creed are actually Christian. If you belong to a non-Nicene Creed affirming church, then your church's baptisms are not recognized as valid by the Catholic Church, which is fine. You know, that just means that you have the same status that, say Muslims do. And the Catholic Church is cool with Muslims. But so basically Benedict's big concession was acknowledging that the members of the SSPX are in fact Christian, which is a level of which, assuming that he did it intending to be kind of a petty jerk, makes me hate Benedict, means that I can't hate Benedict the 16th because I have to respect that level of petty, that level of saying, okay, yeah, we'll admit that you're Christian, but that's it. The other thing that Benedict did in 2007, which the SSPX had asked for, and in retrospect kind of wishes they hadn't, was he said that any Catholic priest can say Mass in Latin according to the 1962 Missal. And this is actually super important because this represents kind of the point where the Vatican's position gets laid out, right? Where they're saying, okay, if you really, really just love the Latin Mass, that's fine. You do go say Mass in Latin twice a day. That's not a problem. The problem is with being in schism. So the SSPX says, well, yeah, but what if we want to be in schism? And they're like, well, that's fine. You can keep being in schism, but if you just want to come back and offer the Latin Mass, this is going to be that would be okay too. And then we have then so you would think, okay, things are not going to change anytime soon, because although is that the face of a man who likes change?
Absolutely.
Yes, that is not the face of a man who likes change. But there is going to be a little bit more change because we have, are you ready for it? Surprise Holocaust denial. Okay. This guy um, is Bishop Richard Williamson, who was one of the guys who was consecrated by Lefebvre in 1988. He was British, by the way. Um, and unbeknownst to Pope Benedict the 16th, he was a Holocaust denier. And so when his name popped up on the list of, oh, this person has been unexcommunicated by the Catholic Church, people who were deep into the world of, you know, arguing with Holocaust deniers were like, Richard Williamson is a Holocaust denier. We are not okay with him being, you know, acknowledged in any way as being a Catholic bishop. And Benedict, in one of the truly like monumental record setting statements by a Catholic pope, becomes the first pope to say, you know what, I probably should have Googled him. He used more words, and it was something like, you know, we we should, the Catholic Church in the future will do better availing ourselves of all the information that is now available in the public record. What he really meant was, yeah, we should have Googled that guy's name and found out, you know, if like maybe he was a Nazi or something. Um, because, you know, he was an active Holocaust denier. And when that came out, Williamson, to be fair to the SSPX, they kicked him out. And Benedict re excommunicated him. And he then kind of toddled off into like the really, really, really weird, like racist, anti-Semitic, really, really terrible people, sedevacantists, who are like so weird that they are beyond the scope of today's live stream. Although there's even more weird there. I can get into sedevacantist weird, and it's even weirder. Oh my god, so much. Okay, but um, so basically the SSPX as of 2007 realizes, oh, we can just, you know, kind of be normal and eventually move back into communion with the Catholic Church, and everything's going to be fine. And and that kind of continued for the next 19 years. And, you know, Pope Francis even granted them permission, even said that 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 weddings that they could that the SSPX could perform licit and valid Catholic weddings and could provide licit and valid Catholic confessions. So basically that means that, like, if I don't know, kick a puppy, and then I feel really bad about kicking that puppy, and I happen to be walking by an SSPX chapel and I see a sign that says confessions now. I can go into that chapel, say, "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned. I kicked a puppy." And the SSPX priest could theoretically say 10 Hail Marys and don't kick any more puppies. You're forgiven, and I can go on my way. Now, again, this sounds like a really big concession, except that that's also the same concession that Eastern Orthodox priests have with regard to Catholics. So basically, Pope Francis is saying to the SSPX at this point, you are as much in communion with us as the Eastern Orthodox are. So they're still not real happy because the SSPX, they're just not happy people at this point because they're not in charge. They don't get to preach crusades. They don't get to burn heretics. They don't get to do anything fun anymore. None of their favorite things are allowed, and that's not cool. All they get to do is chant in Latin, and that wasn't the part that they liked the best. Because if they just wanted to chat in Latin at this point, they would have just joined the SSP. Now, things kind of continue like this for a while until 20 until Pope Francis discovers what a lot of people had started to figure out, which was that a lot of the people who were attending even FSSP chapels were doing so not because they liked Latin, but because they were trying to find a way to be in schism without being in schism. And so Francis reinstitutes the rules that says that you have to have explicit permission from the diocesan bishop in order to have a Latin mass, and that basically doing the mass in Latin is no longer going to be something that automatic permission should be granted for. Like, there has to be an actual legitimate reason. And I want to make clear, there are actual legitimate reasons for holding the mass in Latin that don't involve being a schismatic. Just like, some people like the Latin mass. For some parish, well, like, for example, I go to a bilingual parish. We occasionally have like bilingual masses, and nobody's ever really happy with it because, this prayer's in English, this prayer's in Spanish. Somebody gets left out. Theoretically, you could have a Latin mass, just have the priest do the homily in both languages, which is what they do when we have a bilingual mass, and everything's fine. But we can't have nice things because the SSPX is going around associating liking the Latin Mass with being a schismatic and an anti Semite. It's not fun. Okay. So now we come up to the present day because we had thought, okay, Pope Francis put in, reimposed restrictions on the Latin Mass a little less than a decade ago. That's going to be the status quo forever. But wait, it's not. There's more. Because in February, so actually just a couple weeks ago, the SSPX announced that they were going to consecrate new bishops. Well, actually, no. Let me back up. Okay. So Easter Monday, 2025. Although, what happened that day? Easter Monday, 2025.
I'm
So,
not sure.
something happened.
Mhm.
Something happened to Pope Francis on Easter Monday, 2025.
Okay, I failed my exam.
Yeah, okay. You failed your exam. Okay. Easter Monday, 2025, Pope Francis goes to his eternal reward. I have my own personal opinions about what about where Pope Francis is that I base on the fact, not on any personal spiritual experience, but simply on the fact that he seemed like a nice man who didn't have very many bad habits. And as soon as he died, at least like a billion people prayed for his soul. So, just on logic, he's probably in heaven right now. Just speculating. I know the Pope, a former Pope might be in heaven. This is the kind of, spicy take that, you come to, Nerd Church always bringing the controversy. Okay. So Francis goes on to his eternal reward after he has tried and apparently failed to get JD Vance to get his act together. And we get a new pope. We get Pope Leo, and Pope Leo, he was a kid when he was born in 1954. So he was a kid when Vatican II happened. Shh. Yes, we know. Okay. Ronan, hush. I'm sorry. I have emotional outbursts. Shh. Dogs, hush. Okay. Anyway, here we go. Okay. So we now have a new pope who had actually been an altar boy when the Latin Mass was still a thing. So his major association with the Latin Mass, because he spent, most of his adult life in Peru, where he didn't have to deal with any of these nut jobs. I'm sorry, that was probably not the kindest way to put them. These fine and sincere individuals who have been periodically excommunicated for schism for, a few decades. Leo hadn't had to deal with these guys. So the SSPX thinks maybe we can get some joy out of Leo. So in August, they sent him a letter saying, hey, you know, the remember that guy that got kicked out because we found out he was a Holocaust denier? Well, he's dead now, and we only have two bishops, and we're going to be pretty normal from now on. So can we please maybe like have another couple bishops so that we can keep doing what we've been doing? Because and we promise we'll continue to be good little boys. And Leo says nothing, literally nothing. They do not get a response as far as anybody knows. And they contact them again in September. And do you think that Leo bothered to respond to them? No, no, he did not. Because Leo's like, you know what? I've got like I've got stuff going on in Gaza. I got stuff going on in the US. I've got Opus Dei to suppress. I'm just not going to deal with you guys. Then a couple weeks ago, which is why we have to make this episode because things are just continuing to go crazy. The SSPX announces we are going to consecrate 4 new bishops on July 1st. That's right. July 1st, the anniversary of Marcel Lefebvre and the original 4 bishops that he consecrated getting excommunicated for schism, just in case maybe you thought that they were not being subtle. Because everybody knows that, like, once they get, or at least accepts the fact that if they get excommunicated for schism again, they're probably not going to have an easy way back. So, at that point, Leo calls up his Grand Inquisitor, Cardinal Victor Manuel Fernandez, also known as Tuco, friend of the show. And he says, okay, so he says to him, okay, Tuco, because in my head, Pope Leo calls the head of the DDF by his nickname. I feel like that's a thing he would do. And he says to him, okay, Tuco, you go deal with these guys for me. And basically, Cardinal Fernandez sits down with them and he says, okay, here's the deal. I will sit down with you and explain to you using small words that you can understand all of the things in Vatican II and previous documents that you say you can't accept, and that you say the Vatican has been unclear about. And in exchange for that, you will agree that you will not consecrate any more bishops. And the FSS and the SSPX says, okay, we'll do this if we can have 1 bishop. And now some of what I'm about to say now is like a rumor based on things that have leaked, including the request for 1 bishop. And according to the reports, basically they say, okay, we might consider sitting down and talking with you and seeing if we can work out a compromise on doctrine. But we want at least one bishop. And according to reports, basically what happened was Cardinal Victor Manuel Fernandez looked them in the face and said, "Excuse me, did you think this was a negotiation? This is the deal. You go and decide if you want to take this deal or not." Now, Aldo, I just want you to make a prediction because this is breaking news today. Did they take the deal?
No.
No, they didn't take the deal. That's right. That was just announced today that um, they announced that they are not going to accept the deal, that they are going to go ahead and that they are going to go ahead and consecrate those bishops anyway, and that they invite the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith to come up with an official document stating the minimum requirements to be in full communion with the Roman Catholic Church. And then they are going to decide if they can join with the Roman Catholic Church, which, to be clear, according to them, if that includes accepting Vatican II, and particularly the Vatican II statements on freedom of conscience, religious pluralism, and the idea that there is some possibility for people who are not in communion with the Catholic Church to, not burn in a lake of fire for all eternity, that they will declare themselves the SSPX. Well, they haven't said what they're going to do, but my bet is that they are going to say that anybody who is not part of the SSPX is not really Catholic. And that's going to get really interesting because Pope Leo is a man who is very, very dedicated to getting the band back together and healing all of the schisms. So it's going to be interesting to see how committed the SSPX is to remaining out of communion with the Catholic Church, because as I think has been clear, they've been working really, really, really hard to be schismatic. So that's kind of where we are today. And I look forward to coming up with future updates that will focus more on drama and less on the minutiae of church history. But I think that I've kind of done enough table setting that I can just say, oh, the 1962 missile. And if people don't know what that is, I can say, well, just go back to that episode where I explain all the boring, complicated stuff. So, Aldo, you have been sitting here very kindly and politely listening to me ramble and occasionally answering my rhetorical questions. So, is there anything that doesn't make sense to you, or any that you would like me to clarify, or any thoughts that you have about this whole mess?
Well, I think you were very thorough, very clear, and you just gave us the right amount of information to
Thank
understand
you.
the situation. But I do I do sense some interesting interactions. I'm not sure if I'm correct, but for example, on the side of the Catholic Church, they are trying to keep in some way the doors open
Mm-hmm.
to negotiate, and on the other hand, it is the SSPX like trying to toy around with the situation. So we just try to get as much as we can from the clergy, but as long as we do not compromise the reasons as to why we do not accept all the points from Vatican II and the like. That's what I see. There's this tension between uh, the clergy trying to keep them close, but not trying not to give them full autonomy.
Yeah,
And on the other hand, they try to get as much as they can from the Catholic Church, because in some sense they still depend on the clergy to do their stuff. So
yeah,
it's like a going back and forth between
yeah,
the two groups.
yeah, exactly. And part of that has to do with like also like pastoral concern for the people who are attending SSPX
Mhm.
chapels. Because one thing that should be mentioned is that 500,000 people going to SSPX chapels, because these are people who vehemently reject who vehemently reject like the idea that contraception could ever be permissible,
Mhm.
they tend to have really big families. So of that 500,000 people, probably at least a quarter of them are children under 18 who are not going to SSPX chapels for any like through any fault of their own. And by and the thought on the part of a lot of people is that by remaining by the Catholic Church remaining in contact with the SSPX, it gives those people an opportunity to deconvert from being like in this crazy high control, very into all kinds of, very not good and very unhealthy stuff. It kind of gives those kids the possibility of knowing, well, oh, I can just go be Catholic. Like
Mhm.
I don't have to do all this weird stuff. I can just, go down to my normal Catholic church and do the thing and have it be okay. And I think that that's why there's willing and I think that that's why there's kind of a willingness to maybe show them a little more mercy than people might otherwise think they deserve.
You know, while you were explaining all that, it just kept popping into my head the situation which people like Valentinus and others, other religious leaders from the early church who were later condemned as heretics, and the way that the church back then, not the Catholic Church per se, but they weren't as, I think it's a situation which is repeating today, not
Yeah,
in the sense of a great heresy, going back to the beliefs themselves as to the nature of Christ or whatever, the nature of God, the Bible or whatever, but they form a, they are still Catholic in nowadays, but the clergy is not completely satisfied with them, and they still don't know exactly what to do with them. And that's something that happened with Valentinus, which, correct me if I'm wrong, but he would have become a bishop.
Valentine
Was
is
he
almost, yeah, actually, you're right, but actually, Valentine is almost became Pope.
Pope?
Yeah,
Not bishop. Mhm.
I forget like who became pope instead, but
Mhm.
yeah, like there was a like Valentine. It's like a known historical fact that Valentinus was the second runner-up at that conclave.
Mhm.
So like if people want to get an idea of like how popular Valentinian Gnosticism was, it was sufficiently influential at in its day that the Catholic the Catholic Church as we know it could have like adopted Valentinian Gnosticism. Like there was a moment in time where that could have happened. And but as Aldo said, the Valentinians looked at themselves as being Orthodox Christians
Mhm.
in the same way that the SSPX looks at themselves as being Orthodox Christians. They look at themselves as we are the real Catholic Church. And it's possible, even likely, that as of July 1st, they will declare themselves to be the real true Catholic Church and go off and be schismatic. And it'll be interesting to see if they try to at that point join up with some of the other sedevacantist groups, if they try to say make nice with the Palmarian Catholic Church, which is another schismatic group. The Palmarians are almost entirely in Spain, actually. Um, but they say they have their own, but they've got their own anti-pope. So it'll be interesting to see where it goes. And of course, since the SSPX is mostly a phenomena in France and the US, it's even possible that, political figures like Bishop Strickland, who we're going to be hearing from, next Thursday, if Dapper shows up, might decide to throw in with the SSPX. And that could get really interesting too. So, yeah, there's a lot going on here. And we are going to continue to keep an eye on it. And I hope you'll come back because I've got this great video from a trad calf that I want us to respond to, that just dropped today. That was released after it was announced that the SSPX are going to go ahead with the consecrations. But that is next week. So for now, we will see you on Sunday. Um, Please like, share, and subscribe if you enjoy this content. If there is more things that you want us to hear about, if you want to hear about the Palmarian Church, let me know.